Thank you for joining us for this evening's program on policing with Raphael Mangual, Vikrant Reddy, Chief Dwight Henninger, and our moderator, Allison Sherry. I'm Claire Noble, the Director of Programming for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. We are now in our 49th year of providing the Vail community with thought-provoking and affordable programming. Two items to be aware of before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. That's where you'll type your questions for tonight's panelists. We'll get to those later in the program, and we'll get to as many as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take just a moment to thank some of the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Jeannie and Dale Mosier have underwritten the winter season. Kathy and Neil Kimmel have underwritten the Hot Topics series. And our underwriters for tonight are Deirdre and Ronnie Baker and Holly and Ben Gill. The Vail Symposium is also supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our donors. I'd like to let you know about a program we have coming up on Thursday, March 18th at 6 p.m. We welcome Dr. James Bruce. He's a former senior executive officer at the CIA and a researcher at Rand Corporation. So this will be a discussion of the role of intelligence in shaping foreign policy and the role of senior intelligence advisors in the new administration. Now we turn our attention to a discussion of police reform in America. Our distinguished guests are Raphael Mangual of the Manhattan Institute. He's a senior fellow and deputy director of legal policy and a contributing editor of City Journal. Vikrant Reddy is a senior fellow at the Koch Institute, specializing in criminal justice reform. Chief Dwight Henninger is the chief of police in Vail, Colorado, where he has served since 2002, and he is the vice president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Unfortunately, Chief Perry Tarrant had a family emergency and will not be able to join us. We wish him well. Tonight's moderator is Allison Sherry. She's a journalist with Colorado Public Radio, and she covers criminal justice. More extensive bios can be found at vailsymposium.org. I've also put links in the chat to their pages at their organizations. One last reminder to our audience, if you would like to submit questions for tonight's panel, please use the Q&A option. And again, we'll get to those later in the program. But at this time, I'd like to hand the program over to our moderator, Allison Sherry.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I think I can speak pretty safely on behalf of the two other panelists who are not in Vail right now, is that we wish that we were all together in person and up in beautiful Vail talking to everybody. But this is the way it's going to be tonight. So we're going to try to keep this, even though we're on a computer format, as conversational as possible. I want you all to jump in when you want, but we have a very small amount of time for the caliber of guests we have on this panel and the complexity of subjects we're trying to get to. So I think we're just going to hop right in. I want to start with the crime rate, or more specifically, the violent crime rate. You know, I don't need to remind anyone that 2020 was an extremely strange year. And at least locally, there were very strange trends with all kinds of crimes, from auto thefts to burglaries. But I want to spend a little time on the biggest crime of all, murder. Homicide numbers were up almost 40% in 57 American cities. In Denver, the homicide rate jumped 50% from 63 in 2019 to 95 in 2020. So I'm going to ask all of you a very easy breezy two-part question on this. One, why is this happening? And two, what should leaders, lawmakers, police chiefs do about this? And I'm gonna, go ahead and start. You can start, Chief Henninger, if you want, or Vikrant, if you want to start, please.
You know what, Chief, why don't you go first? You're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. I'd love to hear from you, actually.
Sure. Well, luckily, we haven't seen a significant increase in crime here in Vail, but you're right, there is increase all over the country. And I think there's a number of reasons that attribute to that. I'll leave it to the researchers to give you probably better data, but my feeling is that the The level of frustration and anger around being locked down for a year over COVID is a significant one. The lack of the criminal justice system being able to work effectively during the COVID crisis, and not having jury trials, and a lot of people being let out of jails, has really had a significant impact on a lot of communities. So those, I think, are the two biggest things. And just kind of a level of frustration that I see when I talk to people over the entire COVID circumstance.
Well, I want to put the numbers in a little bit of context before I give an answer. We went through a period in the United States starting in the late 1960s, going on into the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, when crime rates just skyrocketed year after year after year. There was a genuine urban crime epidemic. I suspect a lot of the people who are listening today remember it. You remember how terrifying it was to visit New York City, for example. Raphael, you're in New York. You remember those days. Your parents talk about them. My grandparents talk about them. You saw it in movies. Dirty Harry, right, is a movie about how the cops have to get tough and disregard the rules because of the urban crime rate. Those were terrible, terrible days. We had a very bad year, and I don't want to downplay it. It was substantially worse than last year. The increase in homicide was remarkable. It is, however, much, much lower than those horrible days in the 1970s, 1980s that we all remember. Now, we should talk, however, about why this year was worse than last year and about the dramatic increase. One possible explanation is the one that the chief offered, which is that, people, well, put it this way, you could sort of blame COVID-19 in a sense. I have a grandmother who will say that idle's hands are the devil's plaything. There are a lot of people out there who just don't have anything to do. There's some young men with idle hands right now, and they're getting into a lot of trouble. I think there's something to that explanation. But I think what people want to talk the most about, and what I think is a serious conversation worth having, is whether or not something in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the George Floyd riots may have caused the escalation in crime. There are two possible ways that could have happened. The first is simply that we went through, and maybe are still going through, a kind of anti-police moment. And the police responded by saying, gosh, I better back off a little bit, because if I police too aggressively, I'm gonna hear about it in the media. I'm gonna hear about it in the community. And I don't want to put myself out there like that. Something like that may have happened. I think there's some evidence to suggest that. Another thing that could have happened is that you have people feeling just a dramatic loss of confidence in the police and in rule of law. And what that means is that rather than calling the police to deal with problems, because they think that the police will actually cause more problems than they're going to solve, these people just choose to take matters into their own hands. So if there's an assault, instead of calling the cops, you say, oh, that's too much trouble. I'll just handle it myself. Well, then somebody retaliates about that. And then someone else retaliates about that. And all of a sudden, there's this horrible spiral. And you see homicide kind of skyrocket. So those are kind of three possible explanations. I think there's probably a little something to all of them.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a little bit I agree with in both of these answers. There's a little bit I disagree with, but I'll start with the disagreement because those are always the most interesting points. Yes, it is true that while the United States did see a spike in a lot of cities, that a lot of those cities are nowhere near their peaks. However, there are a lot of jurisdictions that are actually at or have surpassed their 1990s peaks in 2020. Some cities that come to mind that got close: Philadelphia, Chicago got somewhat close, but a lot of smaller jurisdictions: Trenton, New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey, Cleveland, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Louisville, Kentucky. These are jurisdictions that are actually getting quite close to their peaks, and in some cases have surpassed their early 1990s peaks. So, one of the things that I always try to warn against is the sort of aggregation of crime data at the national level, or even the state or citywide level, because in reality, we don't live in the aggregate, right? Everyone experiences crime based on where they are at a given point in time. And so I think it's important to sort of disaggregate some of those jurisdictions and understand that actually quite a few places around the country with very high populations saw homicide totals that they haven't seen since the 80s and 90s. Now, why that might be so, I think there's certainly something to the argument that the slowing down of the criminal court system and COVID-related decarceration likely played a role. I mean, you have people who tend to be criminal justice involved, particularly when they're facing multiple charges or charges that are adding to a pre-existing criminal history. These are people who have a very high likelihood of reoffending if they're not going to be incapacitated pre-trial or sentenced because their cases haven't gone to trial. You're going to have more of these people on the street. That's going to lead clearly to more crime. I do think, though, that there's something to be said also for this idea that police have backed off in the wake of the sort of anti-police sentiment after what happened to George Floyd. I think we saw something very similar after Ferguson and Eric Garner in New York. And there are a few empirical analyses that bear that out. There's a study by Paul Cassell at the University of Utah that focused specifically on Chicago. There was another study from Roland Fryer out of Harvard that was actually looking specifically at the effective pattern and practice investigations. And what he found was that the effective pattern and practice investigations was to discourage police from doing the kind of proactive work that they often do. Specifically, he found sharp reductions in pedestrian stops that were associated with a huge percentage of the homicide spike that followed in those cities. And among those cities was Cincinnati, which of course reached it either reached its peak or came close to its peak this year, as well as Riverside, California, Chicago, Baltimore. So I think that's certainly a big part of it. But one of the other things that hasn't gotten quite a lot of attention are the pre-existing reforms that came before George Floyd in a lot of jurisdictions. There was the criminal justice reform movement more broadly has had a lot of momentum for about 5-6 years. In the wake of Ferguson and Eric Garner, we saw a lot of jurisdictions start to adopt kind of more radical, or at least what would have been considered radical criminal justice reforms even 10 years ago. We've seen very high rates of decarceration in a lot of jurisdictions, very high rates of bail reform. You've had the progressive prosecutor movement win a lot of seats, DA seats around the country, which has led to more drop cases, lower charges, more diversion. And so I think what we saw in 2020 was an unfortunate confluence of all those factors.
And I want to push back a little on the very last point you just made, only because criminal justice reform efforts have been going on for 5-10 years. And I'm talking about a pretty remarkable spike from 2019 to 2020. So I'm not sure, some of those reforms all just sort of bore fruit in 2020 in a negative way. But I do take your point on there. A couple of things that Vikrant said and also the chief said that I want to go back to is the crisis of confidence piece, which I think is a really interesting point. I do want to stop for a moment in what you just said, Raphael, about the lack of policing, and Vikrant mentioned it as well. There is some data locally in Colorado that some criminologists have looked at the University of Denver in a couple of neighborhoods in Denver. One in East Denver, traffic stops were down and police stops in one neighborhood were down 62% in 2020. Now, I think, I'm not sure how much of that has to do with the George Floyd protests or how much of that has to do with COVID, quite frankly. Right. I did a story about how police departments were handling COVID back before George Floyd's death. And a lot of them were saying we're minimizing stops only to minimize the spread of infection. So for whatever reason, the stops were down in this one neighborhood, and violent crime in that neighborhood rose 70% in the exact same time frame. So there is a connection, or there may not be a connection, but there were two pieces of data that happened in that one neighborhood. And I do want to hear from all three of you, because this is a very controversial opinion. A lot of people, criminal justice reform advocates, would say that poor neighborhoods and people of color are over-policed and subject to negative police enforcement. And so maybe we shouldn't pulse everybody over for running a stop sign all the time. Now, police perspective might be, when we stop those people, we might find an illegal gun in the glove compartment and that person is now off the street. So I do want to hear from all three of you. How do you think decreasing policing affects efforts to combat violent crime? And Chief, if you want to start, that would be great.
Sure, I'll be glad to. So the first question about depolicing, many chiefs will tell you that's not happening, but clearly from March till somewhere in the early summer to midsummer, people were not doing proactive work to prevent the spread of COVID because we really didn't know enough about it. We didn't know how to protect ourselves. So that means traffic stops, contacts of pedestrians on the street. Those things were not happening. So clearly had a significant impact on the numbers. But I think it also, there's many studies that show that the interactions that are initiated by the police officer typically have an impact on reducing crime. Although Vail's not the place where there's a lot of people of color to have those conversations, in my previous experience, I worked in Southern California, and the people of color who were good law-abiding citizens wanted the police there. The people who are criminals don't want the police there. So it's pretty confident that that may have had a significant impact, that time frame that was pre-COVID. And then, for a police officer who's seeing, like here in Colorado, where there's decreases in the ability to protect themselves from liability and all the other kind of perceptions of negativity towards the police, I'm sure that many chose to not do as much work, and that's concerning, but understandable.
Did you see, I just want to ask you a real quick clarification, then I want to hear from Vikrant and Raphael on the issue of policing affecting efforts to combat crime or violent crime. Did you see any effects in that decision or your officer's decision to slow down patrolling, stopping suspicious vehicles or traffic stops or whatever?
Well, I have to tell you that we get bored here in between the seasons. After the ski season ended abruptly, and then the start of the summer season, the officers were pretty bored and really wanted to get out and do more work. And we kind of held them back to make sure that they were safe and that we weren't transmitting COVID to people we were having self-initiated contacts with.
So you didn't see any increase in crime or that you've noticed?
The only increase in crime that we've seen is around stolen cars. And I think that goes back to the lack of consequences for stealing cars right now. But I think many officers have made those choices personally, but I haven't seen it here in Vail.
Okay, and Raphael and Vikrant, maybe not you next, and then Raphael to end it on how you really specifically do think decreasing policing affects crime rates.
Yeah, boy, it's an enormously complex topic. Let me try and start with just one simple thing that everybody should agree with, everybody who studies this work. More police generally means less crime. There have been paper after paper after paper that seems to suggest this. Now, you could get to a point where you get diminishing returns, to use the economic language, but you still get less crime whenever you sort of flood the zone with police officers. And whether or not you're in a place where you're getting diminishing returns, it probably depends on what jurisdiction you're in. Like Raphael said previously, it can get a little difficult to aggregate all of this data in all these different places. So that's something I think everybody can agree on. Where things get a little bit more complicated and what I think we don't have a good sense of is, okay, so we know that's the positive. What are the negatives? Everything comes with trade-offs. What are the negatives that come from a lot of really aggressive policing that's out there? And we've already talked a little bit about lack of confidence or loss of trust. Those kinds of things seem real to me. You take a look, for example, at the fact that, to go back to homicide, clearance rates for homicide are unusually low in the country right now. I think there's something at like 60%. But if you go back to, I think, the early 1960s, they were at around 90%. The police are just not solving the murders the way that they used to. And I'm not sure why that is, but one possibility could simply be, going back to this crisis of confidence thing, that whenever somebody has information about a murder, they're worried about calling the police. They've been told by their parents, or they've seen just growing up, that the worst thing I can do is to call the cops. It's going to cause more trouble in my life than it's worth. Things like that could be happening. And so what you really want to do is get to a point where you've got, and of course this is so elusive, but the right kind of policing. You've got plenty of policing out there, but you don't have policing that's so aggressive that it's causing people to lose confidence in the police. And I think you can get it. We don't talk enough about the successes we've had in policing in the last few years, but we've had them. And we've had them, actually, Raphael, in your hometown of New York. I think probably one of the best examples is scaling back stop and frisk. Now, we were told for a long time that if you scale back stop and frisk in New York City, you're going to see the crime rate begin to skyrocket because, as you were asking about in your question, Allison, the argument was, look, the police they stop and frisk these guys and they find stuff. And that's how we catch them on the front end before the violence happens. Well, the thing is, we stopped stop and frisk several years ago, and the crime rate in New York City just continued to plummet. Now, I don't want to draw direct causation there. If you do X, it's going to cause Y. But what you can obviously say is that it's not absolutely necessary to have aggressive stop and frisk policies that cause people to resent the cops in order to get declining crime rates.
Yeah, so I'd agree. I actually don't think it's a controversial point to argue that more police equals less crime. As Vikrant said, I mean, just study after study after study has confirmed this. Criminologists on both ends of the political spectrum, no matter the methodology, I mean, it really is one of the most robust findings in American modern criminology. The other thing I'll say to the second part of your initial question was that, I actually would push back on the notion that people of color generally feel like they are over policed. I mean, there's just one recent example is from a Gallup survey a couple months ago that found that 81% of Black respondents said that they either wanted as much policing as they had now in their neighborhoods or more. So I think that's kind of in conflict with with the general narrative and actually aligned with what the chief has found in his experiences. He was saying that he opened up. A couple of things that I would just push back on with respect to some of Vikrant's points. I do think it's possible that when policing get overly aggressive, they can come into the territory in which they are harming their relationship with the public, which is necessary to get clearances, and particularly in homicide cases. But I would actually argue that the fact that clearances were at 90% in the 1960s may actually undermine this claim, insofar as I don't think that we can say that policing as an institution had as much confidence, had any more confidence in the Black community in particular back then as it does now. I mean, you're talking about right in the middle of Jim Crow, where police were playing a big part in enforcing a lot of those racist laws. I think, I'm not sure we know exactly why clearance rates have declined in a lot of American cities. They certainly haven't declined in all. There's a really fantastic study by Bill Souza looking at clearance rates in Boston, which increased quite dramatically after an intervention was put into place. With respect to the stop and frisk stuff, this is actually a really interesting point because it'll get at some of this disaggregation of crime that I was talking about. It is true that lots of people made very strong claims about stop and frisk reductions leading to crime. And it is true that after stop and frisk reports declined dramatically, crime did not go up a lot. However, these analyses depend on this the kind of aggregation of crime that I was saying is really going to tell us a whole lot, insofar as they were looking at crime levels across New York City as a whole. Now, the problem with that is that you wouldn't expect crime to respond to police tactics in every neighborhood in the same way. Now, in the year 2000, there were 13 New York City precincts that were seeing more than 20 murders a year. By 2014, the year that the Floyd decision came down, which was the litigation that led to the reduction in stop and frisk in New York City, there was only one precinct that was seeing more than 20 murders a year. What happened in the interim was that over that period of time, New York saw a lot of development. They saw an influx in the population in the outer boroughs. They saw a sort of change in the physical environment. You had fewer vacant lots, more businesses, which meant more cameras, more traffic, which is a deterrent to certain kinds of crime, particularly with respect to drive-by shootings. It's nearly impossible to do a drive-by shooting in lots of parts of New York, simply because you'll get caught. There's no viable getaway. And so you have to understand that different neighborhoods and even different sort of blocks within neighborhoods are going to respond to shifts in crime fighting strategies in different ways. And one criminologist named David Weisberg actually decided to look at this and did a study in 2014 of stop and frisk in New York, but used a microgeographic level of analysis, unit of analysis. And what he was doing was looking at street segments. And when he identified the street segments that constituted crime hotspots, what he found was that fluctuations in the level of stops were actually causing pretty statistically significant shifts in the crime rate in those places. And so I would suspect that when you drill down, you would actually find that there was some response to SQF, but one of the reasons we didn't see it register on the citywide level, I think has a lot to do with just how much the city changed. The other thing I'll say too is that, you know, one of the critiques of stop and frisk was the incentive structure that was in place at the time. You know, NYPD officers were getting evaluated in part based on how many stops they were reporting to their superiors. There was, you know, talk of unofficial quotas, et cetera. When the stop and frisk litigation came to an end, the incentive reversed. And in the first couple of years after that, what the corporate monitor who was overseeing the NYPD found was that there was a significant level of underreporting of stops. What they would do is they would listen to radio calls that indicated that a stop should have been reported, and then they went to see if there was a stop report on file, and oftentimes there wasn't. What I have found in talking to police who were in patrol roles during the height of stop and frisk is that they all tell me some version of the same thing, which is that because of the incentive structure, they were over-reporting stops to a pretty high degree. They were either making stops up altogether, or they were reporting interactions as stops that never actually rose to that level. And so I think we have to take some of those top line numbers with a grain of salt.
And I just
Raphael, can I ask a clarifying question? The police officers were telling you that they were making up stops for the sake of the numbers?
Yep.
That's a troubling statement in its own right. Okay.
It is.
It is, and it actually gets to a question I want to ask about data collection in a little bit, but I do want to ask one before we move on to a different subject. Vikrant, and I will also, because the lay people are maybe listening to this, I want to just define, when you say the crime has been cleared, that's a sort of an FBI or a unicorn crime reporting way of talking, but it's
just saying that the crime's been solved. I'm sorry.
It means the crime has been solved, or the case has been closed for some other reason.
Closed. Yeah.
Right. So I just want to make sure we are clear on that, just because I didn't know what that was 5 years ago. So one thing I do want to ask you though, Vikrant, is you said something about the crisis of confidence with police, and I wondered if you could just briefly weigh in on what you think needs to happen to create more confidence in police in the communities of color specifically you were talking about, and then we'll move on to a different subject.
It could be a lot of different things. You know, I think to start with, we just have too many laws out there, and you pass a law, you've deputized the police officer to go and enforce it. And so you really want to ask yourself whether or not that law needs to exist in the first place. Because once you've passed it and you've deputized the police officer to enforce it, you run the risk of all kinds of adversarial interactions. And some percentage of those adversarial interactions will go bad. I'm sorry we keep talking about New York. I want to be able to talk a little bit about Colorado, but I'm intimidated by the fact we've got an actual Colorado police chief here. So I'll stick more to these East Coast cities. So let me give you a New York example that everybody's familiar with. It's the case of Eric Garner. So Eric Garner is selling loose cigarettes on the side of the road in Staten Island. Loose cigarettes means he's selling them individually instead of by a pack. And this is made illegal in the state of New York. I can't remember exactly which year. Raphael may know off the top of his head. It's a crime. 2014. So it's a crime.
That was the incident.
The year that the Garner incident happened. So what happened, as everybody knows, is that police officers went and had a conversation with Mr. Garner. He'd been in trouble before. You know, that conversation did not go well. He felt like he was being harassed. It got ugly. He was put in a chokehold and he died. And we had a huge national conversation about whether or not chokeholds are a needlessly aggressive tactic. And that was a worthwhile, valuable conversation. We're still having it. But the conversation I feel like we didn't have sufficiently was, why does it need to be a crime to sell loose cigarettes in New York? Why did that conversation need to happen in the first place? There's a law professor at Yale, Stephen Carter, who says on the first day of his crim law class, he tells his students, if you want to make something a crime, make sure that you're prepared to have someone die over it. Because when crimes get enforced, things can get violent. It's an unpredictable situation. I would start by just reducing the number of things that are criminal out there. That's probably the thing I would do first and foremost. There are all sorts of other things that we could do, I think, to help the situation. I think things like civil asset forfeiture could get scaled back. I won't get too wonky about this, but basically what this means is that police officers, if they feel that your property, say your car, after they've pulled you over, money that they find in your glove compartment, if they feel that it was probably part of a crime, they suddenly take possession of it. And then your ability to get it back, even if you are not convicted of any kind of underlying crime, be very difficult. You're jumping through all kinds of hoops. That's a real problem. You could possibly make an argument that the militarization of policing can make police officers seem intimidating in ways that cause people to lose trust. There are all sorts of tactical things that can be done. Chief, maybe you could speak better to this, but in places that are somewhere right between being deeply urban and being very rural, you'd like to see police officers walking the beat more than just driving it, so that they're in a position to talk to people, interact with them, and gain trust. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I'm sure Raphael and the chief have ideas too. There's a lot of things that could be done here, but the one that I want to emphasize is the overcriminalization problem. I would try and make fewer things criminal.
Well, I do want to.
If I could just add one.
Yeah, no,
yeah, if I could just add.
Raphael.
If I could add one point, I mean, I agree that, you know, overcriminalization is a problem. Vikrant and I have spoken in favor of overcriminalization reform together, I think, on the same panel in the past. But to me, the thing that jumps out is the legal cynicism that we see in minority communities in particular. There was a Morning Consult poll in 2016 that found that twice as many Black respondents reported worrying more about those they knew becoming victims of police brutality than they did about those they knew becoming victims of gun violence. Now, that result is really troubling, in part because it is completely at odds with what the available evidence tell us. A recent study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences put the odds of dying at the hands of police at 1 in 1,000 for Black men. If you contrast that with the odds for all Americans in general of being killed by gun assault, that's 1 in 298, which is significantly higher. I mean, we're talking almost an order of magnitude here. So, you know, I think one place to start is to just get more honest about what the data say and push back against the narratives that get built around these anecdotes, which are terrible. What happened to Eric Garner was terrible. What happened to George Floyd was terrible. I think everyone understands that. But I do think that we, and I say we because I consider myself in some ways a member of the media, that we in the media need to do a better job of being honest about what the data say, because we are feeding misperceptions that really do have a real effect on attitudes. There was, you know, a study in the 2016 American Sociological Review that found that in the wake of a controversial police use of force, members of Black communities tend to dial 911 at a statistically significantly lower rate in response to crime. That is a problem. And if it's a result of them believing something that is not true, I think it is up to us to make sure that their perceptions, you know, are informed.
Chief Henninger, I do want to get the chief in here real briefly, because I want him to talk a little bit about the confidence piece, and he can speak directly from his experience running Vail, a police department, or generally what you think, you know, as a law enforcement leader, there needs to be done to create more confidence. And then I'm sorry, Vikrant, and then we'll come to you to respond to that. I apologize. I just want to make sure the chief gets in here.
I think there's so many different things that, as Vikrant said, that to be talking about. But what I always talk about is that we as officers need to build trust in every contact we make with our citizens or guests. I think that's one of the successes we have in Yale County is we're so used to dealing with guests here that we're always on that effort to make sure people are having a good experience, even when they're dealing with the cops. And so from my perspective, the more that we can build trust on those one-on-one contacts each time is building to that. The transparency issue is very important. The over-policing and the issue of too many laws. I think you saw that exhibited when you saw a number of sheriffs and police chiefs push back on enforcing the public health orders in the last year, because they didn't want to get into those circumstances where they got down in a knockdown, drag-out fight over somebody not wearing a mask or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I think there's a ton of issues, and I want to be clear. I think policing needs to make changes. We need to do better at reaching out to our communities and having those difficult conversations. So there is some of this is about the police, not just about other folks.
And Vikrant, did you want to respond to something quickly, and then I think we're going to move on.
Yeah, a little bit. I want this out there. There's this Western writer. He's popular in Texas, where I grew up, named Jim Erickson. Maybe folks in Colorado know him too. He has this funny line where he says, "Sometimes the actual truth is buried underneath all the facts." I felt a little bit like that when Raphael was talking about the overwhelming amount of street violence out there and how it's much more likely that somebody would be killed, certainly an African-American or minority would be killed in street violence than they would be by a police officer. That's true. Nobody should doubt that. But the question that can't quite be answered by a statistical fact, it's a values question, is what's worse? Could it be argued, and I think it could be, that it's much worse whenever the agent of violence is the state? It's kind of a ghoulish question to ask. Well, how many incidents of street violence equal, one killing by a police officer? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not even sure that's a productive conversation. But I think we should all understand that on some level, when you are killed by the state, by agents of the state, it's different, and it disrupts the social order in much more significant and substantial ways. I think there's a reason that minority communities worry about that so much.
So I'm going to take a break for the news. A big police reform bill just last week passed the U.S. House of Representatives that bring about a host of pretty dramatic changes, including making it harder for police to obtain no-knock warrants, a bigger, very much more fulsome data collection that the Department of Justice would be collecting on police departments, and qualified immunity changes. And for the lay people who don't totally understand qualified immunity, it's very complicated, but it basically means that cops are immune from being sued individually by people in the community. I'm making that very simple, but that's kind of what qualified immunity means. The Colorado legislature, and for Raphael and Vikrant, you may not know this, but the Colorado legislature last year actually embarked on a very similar bill and passed it quickly in the wake of George Floyd that had a lot of the exact same things. And at the time, I was covering all of the hearings at the state capitol. Law enforcement officers and police chiefs were saying that they were going to lose forces. They were going to lose a lot of people with this qualified immunity change. And I wondered if Chief Henninger, you could talk a little bit about what your experience has been in Vail. Both, have you seen a lot of officers leave because of the changes in the law in Colorado? And also, how has it been to implement this law here?
Thank you. I think the Denver Post did a story on that just this week about it, and it really proves that we're not losing officers like we thought we might. The SB 217, which is the police reform bill that you're talking about, is a very complicated bill, and a lot of the officers didn't understand all the points of it. But the underlying message that some of the officers that I had leave said was, they don't trust us anymore. The people don't trust us. The courts don't trust us. And that was really hard for a few of the officers who just really felt that they were on a mission and a calling here, working in policing. And so that I think is part of the reaction from the police reform from a more visceral level for an individual officer making those decisions. As you said, the issue around qualified immunity is a very complicated one. Really, it's a pretty small percentage of cases that get qualified immunity. It's somewhere between 4 and 12%, and really that prevents the agency from having to do discovery and that type of thing. But the issue is that with qualified immunity is if an officer feels that they're going to get sued every time they do some proactive work, well, they're not going to do as much proactive work, and that's the whole purpose. We give judges and district attorneys and all elected officials absolute immunity, which is the next higher step. They can't be sued for anything. And so I think that the officers are really concerned that they're going to lose their homes and their families' wealth because they took some proactive action.
Yeah, qualified immunity is really one of these issues that's just strange, because I think both sides of this debate tend to overstate their cases. I think that proponents of qualified immunity reform overestimate the effect that it has on police litigation, which is to say that the chief is exactly right to note that a very small percentage of cases filed against police officers get tossed on qualified immunity grounds. It is just not a particularly effective bar to recovery. You could argue that there's some subset of cases that don't get taken up because the cloud of qualified immunity hangs over those cases. There may be something to that, but we're probably talking about a marginal difference. In part because the vast majority of police departments around the country indemnify their police officers against individual liability in their collective bargaining agreements. And the ones that don't, police officers, of course, have the ability to pool their risk and insure themselves. And because police use of force is, although contrary to what many people believe, is an extremely rare phenomenon, given the sort of overall volume of police activity, premium rates tend not to be super responsive to litigation filings. But that also means that police officers who object to qualified immunity reform may be overstating their case as well, insofar as, given that reality, they're probably their daily lives probably aren't going to change all that much. At least that's what I suspect will happen after more jurisdictions adopt their own versions of qualified immunity reform. But just the data just aren't really there. I mean, in New York City, the Legal Aid Society has an online portal of cases filed against the NYPD. There's like 2,400 cases in that portal right now. It's like between 2015 and 2018. I think there are only 74 cases out of that 2,400 that were resolved in favor of the NYPD officers involved in that litigation. So we're talking here about a very small percentage. The vast majority of these cases are getting payouts. Again, those payouts may be smaller than they otherwise would be. But here, it's at least in New York, it's going to be the department, footing the bill. And I think, again, it's just one of these things that lots of people don't really understand. And you can make some intuitive arguments on both sides that seem right to people. And so they kind of gravitate towards their polls. But I think if we're sober about the data analysis here, I don't think that things will change all that much in either direction, regardless of what's done on these bills.
Vikrant, do you think it should be easier for cops to be sued by members of the general public?
Well, let me say this. I'm generally a supporter of scaling back qualified immunity, but I think Raphael's probably right that it's easy to overstate the case by both sides. What I think I would focus on is probably the theme. We've been talking for 40 minutes now. The theme of this conversation that keeps coming up over and over again is the crisis of confidence in policing. I wonder to what degree, you asked me, Allison, what kinds of things we could change policy-wise that would help improve confidence. I wonder if qualified immunity, even though it doesn't really result in a whole lot of cases at the end of the day, I wonder if its symbolic power matters for this crisis of confidence issue. I wonder, Raphael was talking about the fact that it's much less likely for a member of minority community to pick up the phone and call 911 when there's a problem. We don't have a really good sense of why that is, of why they're so mistrusting of calling 911 and what will follow. There's lots of reasons. Probably one of them could be because they've had enough conversations over the dinner table where somebody started talking about the fact that this police officer did this thing and he got off because he was, quote, immune, and people were ferociously mad, understandably. And those kinds of stories just get told over and over and over again. So I think, finding more ways to hold agents of the state accountable would be helpful, possibly in this incredibly important symbolic way. And that symbol would result in more confidence in the police and all the attendant benefits.
Can I jump in there real quick on that? I guess my perspective is that it's the police chief's job to do that. But many police chiefs have had their hands cuffed really by their legislative bodies by taking away their ability to fire an officer who's doing a bad job. And that's really concerning. And I think that has happened in a lot of states where there's union power that are working on trying to get additional benefits. And when they don't want to pay benefits, they take away management rights. And so I'm lucky here in Colorado, we're a right to work state. I can fire an officer who does a bad job or I think who's done something illegal or immoral. And so that isn't always the case everywhere. And there's a lot of chiefs I talk to who have fired somebody and they get them back again because the courts or their, public civil service system gives them back to them. And that's really problematic. So I think it's up to the chiefs to change the culture in their organizations, but it's also, our elected leaders who need to give them the support to be able to do the job they need to do.
So as a chief, you wish it was easier to fire officers who were doing a bad job or they did something wrong on the job?
In Colorado, I have that ability. In probably both of the coasts, it's much more difficult in this country to fire an officer who's doing a bad job or does something lawful, but maybe awful.
I want to talk, speaking of the confidence and the accountability piece, the federal law, which I was referring to earlier, it still needs to pass the Senate. It's a proposed law, I guess. It still needs to pass the Senate. The data collection piece, it sounds a little dry, but it's a pretty big deal. Police departments forever have not really wanted to furnish large data on police encounters, who they stop, use of force, demographics, the demographics of people they stop. And for this law to require that, some kind of reporting to the Department of Justice, sort of nationwide, is a sea change. And, having data all in one place where anyone can look that up. I wondered if you, all of you, could talk a little bit about how this would change the way officers did their jobs.
Well, I think it depends how these agencies intend to comply with the contours of this bill, right? They're going to be incentivized to provide as much data as possible. I think one of the reasons why we haven't really seen a lot of this around the country is that in the United States, we have about 18,000 plus police agencies, all of different sizes and with different amount of resources available to them. And the kind of data collection, recording, cleaning, et cetera, that needs to happen is expensive. It takes time, it takes man hours. And if you're a small department with 17 deputies, you have to pick and choose where you're going to put your resources. And so I think that actually plays a huge role, in why there's so little data. I mean, if you do look at the bigger departments, the Chicago Police Department, the NYPD, the LAPD, Houston, you tend to actually see a relatively large amount of data being publicly available, for some decades now. Again, it could always be better. I say this as someone who does research in this space. It could always be better. It is often a pain to get my hands on data points that I could use, to investigate a claim. But I do think that it is going to be all to the good. I do think it can help with the transparency, which again I think is important in terms of the crisis of confidence that we see. But I'm also I think we have to be circumspect about how much confidence we can expect something like this to lead to. I mean, there have been, as Vikrant pointed out, I mean, in New York, the NYPD has just been a model department in so many respects. In 1971, the police shot 810 people, killed almost 100. By 2016, they wounded 23, killed just 9. In 2018, the city passed the Right to Know Act, which requires police officers to apprise people of their right to refuse consent to a search. Of course, there was a sharp reduction in stop and frisk that we mentioned earlier. Arrests are down 37% since 2013. Yet, in terms of the tone of the public debate, none of those changes seem to be reflected. There's about as much distrust as there ever was. And so, I think we just have to be a little skeptical of the claim that pulling these levers, while probably good in and of themselves, will likely have a limited effect on the public's confidence, at least insofar as we remain a society in which the realities of what the data say get obscured by the narrative.
And I want to hear from Vikrant, and then I want to hear from the chief on how he's been doing data collection so far, because the state law in Colorado does require some of that as well.
Well, look, Raphael is right. Asking guys like me and him, think tank guys, whether or not there should be more data out there is like asking Cookie Monster whether or not Chips Ahoy should increase production. I think we all know what the answer is going to be. I'm a big supporter of getting stronger data collection. I think Raphael is probably right that the main reason you don't have it is that in very small places, it's just difficult. You have to figure out where to put your resources, and you don't always want to put it into something like data collection. But I would say things like that are worth paying for. And I think it would be great to be able to study these things a little bit better. Actually, one thing that can be considered a real crisis is the fact that we have decent data in large urban areas because they have more resources and can collect the data, but we know much less about what's happening in rural areas when it comes to rural policing, precisely because they're not collecting the data. They don't have the resources. Now, there's a big difference between urban and rural policing. They require different strategies. And I just think we need to learn more. I think we need better numbers. I think that would be helpful. I also think, by the way, there's a phenomenon in psychology. I can't remember what it's called, but the basic idea is that when people know they're being observed, the behavior changes. And I think, once you have a lot more police officers in the country knowing that a lot of things are being recorded and detailed and then being sent off to the Department of Justice, you might see behavior changes that can be beneficial in the long run.
Chief, what do you think of that? And tell me what it's been like to increase data collection in Vail.
Well, to Vikrant's point, I know that having people wearing body-worn cameras has improved police work and has also improved the response from the citizens we're contacting having that camera on. I don't agree with the philosophy that if we collect more data, officers will be better. We've been collecting data in Colorado for a lot of different things, and I don't think it's changed things at all. My frustration is, as both speakers have said, It costs a lot to collect that data. It costs a lot in time and manpower and spending money on computer systems to capture all that data. And a lot of that we've already captured in Colorado has never been analyzed or used appropriately. And that's the big fear that chiefs have. We're now collecting 21 data points for the new law that was passed last year here in Colorado. And what will happen with all that data and how will it be interpreted? You know, always the fear is that, you know, we'll stop too many people of a specific color and it doesn't match exactly the population and that makes us racist. And that's, you know, a pretty big jump. And as somebody said earlier, you can get the number to say whatever you want them to say. So that I think is our fear is what's the value of it. It's not going to change officers' behaviors, I think, on the one call at a time each time they're having those conversations with citizens.
And I think to answer quickly your question, I think people like me and Vikrant and Raphael are going to look at that data. That's what it's going to come to. But I do appreciate your point, and I am mindful of the time. I know that Chief Henninger, you were going to give us a little bit of an overview of what's happening in Vail, and I wanted to talk about, you know, Vikrant had mentioned rural policing. We've talked a lot about urban policing. You're kind of in the middle right there between the two. You run a medium-sized to small law enforcement agency, but you live in a town with a load of tourists. You get 2 million, your bio said you get some 2 million tourists a year. So tell me what unique challenges and expectations that brings to your job.
Well, rural policing, people know each other more, and that goes back to the comment earlier about when we put police officers in cars and have them roll up their windows and drive around, they don't know people any longer. And that's a real failure on our part. And in rural communities, even in Vail, we know our citizens a lot better, and that's very helpful. They feel comfortable to call me when they have a concern, and that doesn't happen everywhere. You know, here in Yale County, we have great police officers and deputy sheriffs who work very hard to solve people's problems and help them have a good vacation while they're here. We're lucky. We've done a lot of training in this county. Some of it's required at the state level. We do de-escalation training. We do community policing training. We do proper use of force training, and a lot of anti-bias training too. And so those things have been going on for a long time. We're most proud that most of our officers and deputies have been trained in the crisis intervention training model, which is a 40-hour class on how to better deal with people with mental health issues. If you go to the Washington Post database about how many people are getting killed on an annual basis in this country, a lot of them, I think 30% or so on an average, are by the police, are being killed, you know, who have diagnosed mental health issues. And so that crisis intervention team training is really important for the ability to de-escalate circumstances. One of the things I'm most proud about in our county here is in a collaboration between the Yale County paramedic system and their community paramedic system and all the law enforcement agencies and the Hope Center, we have a co-responder model where when we go out on a call that may involve somebody having a mental health crisis, we send all three of those disciplines out at the same time. The officer makes sure it's safe at the scene. The crisis counselor helps determine the problem, and the community paramedic makes sure they don't have any medical conditions. And once they determine it's safe, the officer leaves, and then they help find them treatment. That's reduced numbers of emergency room visits for mental health issues to, you know, in the range of 60%. And our transports to a secure facility have gone down over 70%. So we're excited about that. And that's an emerging issue around the country that we're excited that we think will be very successful. And I guess the most important thing is because we're a small community, we can provide transparency. And when people ask questions, they get answers to those questions. So I'm excited about the way we do policing here. Hopefully most of the citizens that are on this symposium call are also. But the other thing is it's easy to call me and say, hey, I have a concern about the way you're doing work.
And I bet we don't have the time for it, but I bet you have some really crazy tourist stories or mountain tourist stories that have to do with people coming in and trying to go skiing. And
our local judge says our problems are late night alcohol-induced good ideas, which is probably accurate for a lot of places, but particularly for Vail.
And you know, alcohol hits you at a higher elevation a little earlier. Well, I know we want to take some questions from the audience. I know there may be a lightning round, so I'm not sure what kind of time we have, Claire, if you want to weigh in on that.
Sure. I would just ask, I'm going to try to get in as many audience questions as possible, if you could answer them as quickly as possible. And so this first question comes from Lauren, and he's wondering if there's any examples of cities around the country that have actually bucked the trend and have lower crime rates. And if so, what do you think accounts for that success?
I think Baltimore actually had lower crime in 2020 than they did in 2019, but that's largely a function of the fact that in 2019 they had set a record for that city. So it was just a small downward shift from an all-time high. But I'm not aware of any cities that fall into that category.
I'm not aware of any from last year either, but I would say that over the last 20 years, crime rates have been steadily declining throughout the United States. Every place, in a sense, is kind of a good example, up until last year, which was this really peculiar and awful and terrible year. But before that, we actually had been doing a lot of things well in the country.
So it seems that COVID and the pandemic have changed policies and procedures for a lot of organizations. And Greg is wondering, Chief, what changes do you expect to be permanent, for better or worse, in your department?
Sort of a difficult question. I think we're all very excited about getting back out into the field and having interactions with people, our Coffee with a Cop and our Citizens Police Academies and our Spanish Citizens Academy, and having in-person meetings with our Law Enforcement Immigrant Alliance, where we build trust with our immigrant community. But I think the things that will change are, in the kind of more administrative efforts, like having Zoom meetings and not driving to Denver for every meeting and that type of thing. Some of the safety precautions to try to make us safer will probably continue as we move ahead. But other than that, I don't see, huge differences in the way we do policing.
Raphael, this next question is for you. It comes from Warren, and I'm asking it to you. Anybody else can weigh in, because I know you've spoken on this recently. Illinois just passed last week no cash bail. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, cash bail, I think, is a problematic model. I have said this in basically everything that I've written on the topic over the last year. The idea that whether or not we release someone should turn on their wealth, I think, is silly and an inefficient way to make that kind of decision. What I would like to see, and what the Illinois law actually allows to be done, is for judges to center that inquiry around the risk that a particular defendant poses to the community, whether we're talking about risk of reoffending or risk of flight. The problem is that, at least in places like Chicago, we do not see judges and prosecutors sort of responding to that risk in the way that I think we would all like. And I think that's actually the biggest driver of the crime that we've seen in the wake of the bail reform in Chicago, which, has been significant. Again, I would point to Paul Cassell at the University of Utah, who did an analysis of this, in part because of an investigation that the Chicago Tribune did. But yeah, it is troubling. What we're losing out on in a lot of these bail reform jurisdictions are the sort of incapacitation benefits in the short term that we would get if those people were otherwise incarcerated. I think that we are likely incarcerating too few serious offenders pre-trial, but it's mostly a function of judges not sort of reading those risk profiles correctly, or at least not being willing to heed what those risk profiles say. But there are other jurisdictions like New York, which have done it completely wrong. In New York, judges may not consider risk at all at any stage of the pretrial release decision. We are the only state in the country that has that prohibition in place. And so, I am sympathetic to people who want to reform bail. I think, wealth is not a particularly strong proxy for risk. But we have to also be willing, to act on what those risk profiles say.
Let me jump in real quick on that, if I could. Just,
Sure.
I think there's two things that are forgotten in that discussion. I agree, bail reform needs to be reformed, but there's two issues. One is the risk of reoffending, as Raphael's talking about. We've seen a lot of that happening in this past year with, I think it's 25% reduction in jails and prisons around the country. And that's a significant problem. And the other part is, that really puts the victim, who's sort of forgotten about the victim, in talking about, them and somebody reoffending against them who's been let out of jail or prison.
That actually could be playing a role in clearances as well, insofar as, people are going to be less likely to cooperate with investigations if they're not confident that the person on whom they'll be telling is going to be incapacitated. It's much harder to tell the police about someone who lives next door.
Well, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Allison for the lightning round, and thank you all for your participation.
You're still on mute.
Yep.
That's the new 2020.
Sorry,
Thanks,
I apologize. So we only have a minute or two, so I'm just going to keep, I guess the lightning round would be if you could each keep an answer to a minute. we'll start with Vikrant, and then each of you could answer. If you have unlimited resources, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about policing to make it more effective, and how you define effective is totally up to you, what would you do?
Oh, I'm going to resist answering the question, unfortunately. You know, I rattled off, it's just one of those things where it can't possibly be one thing. There are just so many things that have gone into this crisis of confidence that if you were to solve one thing, at most, you would probably fix 2 to 3% of the problem. You have to fix all of these things. They all matter at the end of the day. And I think, you know, that's what makes it such a great challenge. But I'm afraid I'm just gonna have to resist, Allison. We got to do a lot.
Okay, do you want to say one thing you'd like to do?
I'll go back to the overcriminalization point I talked about earlier. If we could find a way to scale back a lot of these unnecessary crimes, if we could, maybe I'll say this, there are a lot of things that are social problems that I think we are asking police officers to handle that, you know, maybe isn't the best use of their time. The best use of their time is addressing violent crime. It's not necessarily addressing drug addiction or homelessness or some of these other kinds of problems. If we could find other ways, traffic problems. 10,000 people were issued window tinting citations in North Carolina just last year. You know, these kinds of things I don't know we need to be asking our police officers to do. I guess maybe that's what I do with my magic wand first.
Okay, Raphael, unlimited resources. You could change one thing about policing to make it more effective.
I think the obvious answer here has to be to address the recruitment and retention crisis that the country's been seeing for about 10 years now. The number of police has been pretty steadily decreasing. That decrease has gotten on an even sharper downward plane in 2020, where we've seen retirements just jump up to levels not seen in years in a lot of jurisdictions around the country. You know, as Vikrant noted earlier, more police equals less crime. Ultimately, I think that's how we should measure the success of police departments. You know, they are first and foremost the first line of defense, you know, for citizens who should not have to, you know, worry about defending themselves and their property. And I think that's a noble enterprise, and I think we need to do more to attract high quality recruits to it. And you know, that's going to take a lot of money and resources, but I think it'll pay off in the end.
Chief?
Great answers. I guess my thing is we got to stop laying all of the social problems on the young police officer out there at 2 o'clock in the morning to solve. And we can't have them be the mental health counselor, the drug and alcohol abuse counselor, the homelessness person, and be responsible for all those things, because each of those interactions, because there's not a lot of resources, provide opportunity for violence to erupt out of those discussions. In Vail and Eagle County, it's a lot about housing, and we run into a lot of people who are without housing, and that's not just a resort problem. That's a problem around the country.
See, we could go on for another hour, Claire.
Yes, we could.
We can hold it. We can hold it at this.
You guys have been amazing, and we were honored that you shared your expertise and your time with us tonight. Thank you so much. For everyone watching at home, I hope you'll join us next Thursday on March 18th. We shift our discussion to the intelligence community and foreign policy. Thank you, everyone, and good night.